Hi, I'm Nick Marinkovich, the illustrator for Dead Romans, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book and graphic novel creators and supporters. On this episode, I chat with Nick Marinkovich about illustrating Dead Romans from Image Comics, plus a whole lot more. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel. If you want to help the site and the podcast, please consider supporting the effort by chipping in at ko-fi.com/True North Country Comics. Your patronage is greatly appreciated. Based in Toronto, Ontario, Nick is an illustrator, graphic novelist, and multimedia artist. He's worked for IDW, Devil's Due, and Marvel, as well as releasing his own titles under Image and Pop Sandbox. He's known for his signature ink-rendered, photo-based artwork that is heavily stylized. Nick's most recent work is Dead Romans, co-created by Fred Kennedy for Image Comics. Dead Romans is a story of Arminius, a Germanic prince raised in Rome, who has sworn vengeance against the empire that butchers his people. He wants to make a queen of the woman he loves, Honoria, a fellow slave. Now 50,000 Romans will die to give her a throne she never asked for or wanted. So without further ado, here's my chat with Nick Marinkovich about illustrating Dead Romans from Image Comics, plus a whole lot more. So Nick Marinkovich, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Thanks for having me on.
I appreciate your time. Before we get started with all the questions, I want to ask you, what was the first comic book that you read?
First comic book I ever read, probably, I think the first one that made a big enough impact that I was kind of drawn into this high stakes world of comics was the John Byrne, Chris Claremont Dark Phoenix compilation. Oh. My older brother, he's the one who kind of introduced me to them, and he had it, and I saw this cover and I was just, what's this, and read it through and through, and that jump started me to collecting. I wanted to collect all the back issues. From there I was just hooked. In tandem with that, one of the other ones, I want to mention this one as well because, no one remembers it, and I think it's such a shame, was my other brother, when he saw I was kind of getting into comics, he got me this graphic novel. I remember it was Beowulf, illustrated and written by Jerry Bingham, who, I don't know if many people remember him, but he was such a wonderful artist, and that was on First. If anyone remembers First Comics, one of those oversized prints, and I still have that book to this day. It's one of those cherished ones in my collection. The art is just gorgeous. Those two books were the ones that always come to mind when I think of my youth and comics.
Yeah, those are classic things to get into. I mean, to have that as your first introduction is just amazing, that's for sure. But that being said, I want to ask you, that was great for youth, but wondering who or what inspires you to create today?
The guys who I considered, my heroes, if you will, growing up. I mean, I still reference them today. Sienkiewicz was a huge influence in my youth and today. On my shelf, I have Sienkiewicz, Kent Williams, another one. I could name you every artist that drew X-Men from Dave Cockrum straight through to, Jim Lee. Mm-hmm. And I would say they all, especially the runs of, Cockrum, Byrne, Smith, JRJ, and Silvestri. Those really had big impacts on me. Today, I still go back to those guys.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
all the time, yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's guys I'm leaving out that are huge. Well, you know who else? I went through a huge phase where I just wanted to study illustration, just illustration as an art form itself, and I was really drawn to that golden age of classic illustrators in the 70s, like Bernie Fuchs and Bob Peak. I really like poster art, and definitely they had an impact on. I mean, you see it. That's not novel, after all. I mean, Sienkiewicz is early, and they were his influences, and it was almost like in studying his art that I discovered them.
Oh, okay. That's cool.
Absolutely. Yeah.
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 Yeah. No,
Um,
I see some of that in your artwork. That's for sure. I was going to say, like, I think I was just glancing at Dead Romans that we're going to talk about. And I said, wait a second. I can see some Sienkiewicz in there. So
well,
that's
you,
cool.
it's funny. I was having a conversation with Ho-Che Anderson recently, and,
Hmm.
I was telling him how to this day, I still wonder, do I even have a noticeable style, or am I just, a mishmash of my influences? But I would imagine many artists has that, has that dilemma. And
Yeah, I
don't know
think
if,
that is a conundrum, right? Because as I think we all trying to get, influenced by something. We're inspired by something, and we try to make our own take on it. And someone would probably say we're the sum of the parts of all that's come before, and try to sort of synthesize that into our own sort of voice. Yeah, no,
yeah.
you got it. That's for sure. So,
As
yeah,
Frazetta said, you put it all in a blender and you try to come up with something that's your own, right?
yep,
And
that's right.
yeah.
That's cool. So let's get talking about your new series that's just wrapped up its first arc, I guess I could say maybe, Dead Romans. And I have talked to Fred Kennedy about it, but wanted to get your take. So what do you think the story is about for those who are not familiar with it, and maybe what inspired you to make it with Fred?
Oh, our classic response. It's a love story in the midst of extreme carnage. So for those who don't know, it is based on the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, which was one of the ancient Roman Empire's greatest defeats in history, where 3 Roman legions were annihilated by German tribesmen in the Teutoburg, which is a forest in Germany. And to give you some context, that was unheard of in the era. The Romans were the elite by far, by a huge margin, the most powerful army in the known world at that time, i.e., the Mediterranean. And for them to be slaughtered by a loose band of tribesmen it couldn't happen. And yet that's what our story is. And our story follows the actual leader, Arminius, who was a Roman general, but born of a German tribe, and his lover, Honoria, who he is looking for in the midst of this battle. And unbeknownst to her, he is the one who actually betrayed the Romans and is leading the German tribes in this foray. And yet she's a loyal Roman. So there you have the conundrum of what's going to happen.
Yeah, very intriguing. So what was it that Fred said that you said, I'm on board? What did he say?
The way all good collaborations start. We were having beers, and we're both Roman history enthusiasts. When he first brought it up, I was listening to this podcast. It was the History of Rome podcast by Mike Duncan, and I was listening to that podcast, and I was like, there's so many good stories. There's Caesar's Gallic campaigns. There's the Punic Wars with against Carthage and Hannibal, and I thought, wow, that would make such a great story. And then Fred pitches me this, this one that he's already written, and I was just like, okay, that's got to be a sign. And I kind of wanted to work with him anyway, so it just kind of fell into place, like little bit of synchronicity there. And he showed me the script. I loved it right away, and I just knew that I could kill it.
Okay.
I knew. I mean, that sounds egotistical, but I knew that. But it was a challenge, like first of all, as well, in terms of growing as an artist, I had never done anything with large army shots. For example, crowds are, they pull your hair out in drawing them. But I wanted that challenge. I wanted to draw these big battle scenes with, thousands of soldiers. The Roman army just looks amazing. I really wanted my take at the costumes and the setting. And I was hooked right away. I did so much research going into it. Starting off by like really just watching HBO's Rome, which is by far the best one for those interested in that era. It was just such a good production and so authentic in terms of their costumes, their weaponry, just the design of everything. And that was just my starting point. I really wanted to get era authentic. When people say the Roman Empire, that's 1,000-year run. It didn't look the same throughout that 1,000-year, and I really wanted to focus on the era that we were working in, what the armor types would have been, what the weaponry would have been, all those little details, all that minutia. I really jumped on board that, man. Like, oh, if you see my archive of references, it's mind blowing.
Yeah, that's always a challenge I find for artists and creators, is trying to be as authentic as they can. It sounds like you've already had that under your belt, something, as you said, listening to podcasts and being a real true fan of that period of time. So I guess it wasn't that difficult for you to just launch into it and start going at it with Fred.
Yes, but as well, I'm quite pedantic when I get down to it. But at the same time, I did want to put my take on it. I didn't just want a photographic look at, say, for what their armor is like. I wanted to give you that impression of these guys who are just these killing machines. Like, for example, Regulus the Centurion, he was the first character I designed, and I think he was, just my favorite throughout the whole thing. And I really exaggerated, say, the shoulder plating on him, and I think it's hard for us to conceive how hardcore these guys were, given that they were just using, a sword and shield, and yet could take out a dozen men easily. That's no small feat. That's how tough bred these warriors were, and I kind of wanted to give that impression to this guy just by looking at him. He was just this intimidating guy who could rally another 100 guys under him, and get them fighting when they're completely surrounded and hopeless. That was kind of my goal, and I hope I achieved it.
Sure, absolutely. Now, you said that Fred came to you with the script intact. I'm wondering, what was this collaboration process like? Can you describe, like, it was a little bit of back and forth, or did you just say go to it and you just did the artwork and that was it?
Oh, absolutely. There was a lot of back and forth. It's funny, but right now we're going to be releasing the hardcover soon in November, and we're actually including a little segment on our process. And in it, Fred got some of our message chats, which get extremely silly. It's just nonstop joking. It's two clowns working. Fred can attest to this. I just littered him with questions about all these little details. Just to, I really want to. When you, as an illustrator, it's your interpretation of the writer, but I really want to try to capture his vision as true as possible. And I believe the further we went in it, the better I got at it. And starting off with issue 1, and I gotta give credit to writers. When you're launching a new IP, it's tougher on the writer, I believe, because as an artist, you can just knock it out of the park and look pretty right from page 1. Whereas the writer has that uphill climb with all the setup while trying to capture the reader. It's hard. It's different when you're jumping onto an established series where everyone knows the characters. And it's a 6-issue series, so you really had, the first issue was entirely setup. And I got to hand it to Fred. I tried to make his job easier by really, not to toot my own horn, but I really wanted to make the art eye-catching to get that reader in there so Fred could do his job well. So even with the first issue, I think I really improvised the layouts, but much more than what he had intended. Not that he had any problem with it. He didn't. He's always been great about that. But I believe I was closer to achieving his voice, like in terms of a genuine collaboration, by about, I think, issue 3, it really gelled, where you start to notice that timing, that cadence in his style of writing. And I was able to emulate that better at that point. And from there on in, I think it's really like issues 3 to 6, I believe, were the ones where really, I think it's an ideal compilation between a writer and an artist. For me, it was a crescendo the whole way until the finale with issue 6. I think that was our strongest issue.
Cool. Cool.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears a wee bit and talk about the tools used to create your art. I wonder if you could walk me through your workflow when you're putting this together.
Well, Dead Romans was and a lot of people ask me that, and Dead Romans was entirely done digitally on a Cintiq tablet in Photoshop, because people always say, well, it looks like it's painted. That's a great compliment, and that is my, I have always tried to approach it that style. For some background, I did used to, was starting out, I was pure analog. I used to do, I was an inker and colorist starting out. I was using watercolors and, the standard quill pen and brush. And then I did the transition about less than 10 years ago, I would say, for the sake of expediency. And I wanted to try out. A friend of mine sold me on the Cintiq tablet, and I got it. And it's a quick learning curve. Like, you get used to it really quickly. And one of the big jumps for me was I found this brush set called Groot brushes by this guy, Nikolai Groot. And it was like the first, like, wow, it felt like painting. And I started to experiment with his watercolor and oil brushes in a way that I never really experimented using analog. And I tried to do the same approach that I would on paper, where I was like layering, especially with my covers. I start with a base layer, and then I'm layering the paints over top of it, just like I would on a canvas. I tried to keep that, and I would brush out the overlayers so you can get a sense of the underlayer below it, kind of like the style that Fuchs used to use. I really wanted to capture that. So when you're seeing like a contour, that's often from the base coat, and I really like that effect when you can really capture it. Before starting any drawing, I'm notorious for my references. I get them all just in front of me, so that once I get my layout down, I'm so pedantic about getting the look right. But I do have a trick in order to get a little bit more style out of it. Once I have my layouts down, my breakdowns, I throw out the references and just, now it's in your head. Do the rest. So that way it's not a photograph, that way you're adding a little flair to your drawing. It's your style at that point. I mean, that's the way I try to do it.
Sure.
I know other artists can do it without doing all those, and I tip my hat to them because I wish I could, but I'm just not there.
I want to ask you, I mean, we hinted about Dead Romans continuing, but wondering, do you have any other up-and-coming projects that you can talk about?
Absolutely. So another series that I've been working on, this goes more into, our Canadian history, but it's a series called The Voyager, where I'm working with writer Jeff Sturge on that. And we had actually started, book one came out, I believe it was back in 2014 or so, and it was published through Guernica Editions. They're a Canadian publisher, and they're a literary publisher. So, I think the book fell a little bit under the radar, more so than I would have wished, because it was their flagship graphic novel. And to produce it, we had actually won the Ontario Arts Council grant, the Writers' Works in Progress grant. So that provided the majority of the funding, as well as a Kickstarter campaign for me to do it. It was a 100-page graphic novel. It starts in Ireland with our main character, Fintan. And eventually through the story, he will eventually meet up with Samuel de Champlain as they head to the New World to establish the Quebec colony, hence the title, The Voyager. Book one, I mean, it did okay, but when Jeff showed me the script for book two, I thought we had a real winner there that we needed to do. So I started it even before we had solidified the funding for it. But, then reality kind of took over. And after getting about halfway through, I had to shelve it for a while, just to work on other projects that were simply bringing in more money. But at the whole time, I would keep going back to Voyager 2. And then Dead Romans happened, so I had to completely shelve Voyager for a year and a half while I did Dead Romans. And now that that's finished, we're back on the track, and it's going great. And I plan to I only had 20 pages left, and I'm just finishing those up right now. So Voyager 2 should be coming out ideally in the spring of 2024. I'm really happy with the way this book is coming along. I think it's just at another level from what we did with book one. And I was happy with book one. That's what I'm working on now. And I'm starting to show little previews of it on my socials at the moment. And it's coming along really nicely.
Good to hear. Looking forward to it when it comes out. That's for sure. Now, here's a question that a little bit off the beaten path, but I've been asking other creators, and it's about AI. So in reference to comic book creation, I wanted to get your take on it, whether you think that AI is helpful or harmful to comic book creation.
And it's interesting you bring that up, because I had a conversation about this just earlier this evening with a friend of mine. And I mean, definitely, as with many other artists, when using AI is a huge faux pas. It threatens your livelihood, first of all. And as well, I mean, there's an aspect of it being laziness, and people who don't want to do the work but want to get the result for it. Having said that, there's almost like that reality. Is it going to go away? At present, I haven't delved into it to the degree that I wanted to, but I've wanted to experiment with it in terms of, can it help my workflow, for example, with references, where right now I literally use a camera. Mm-hmm. And I have always wondered, can it speed up that process so that I can somehow make use of it to do that background work? But then when it comes to actually drawing, it's still going to be me. Like, I'm never going to let that go, because I feel at that point you're no longer being an artist. And anyone who uses it to completely generate their imagery, like, I'm sorry to say, you're not doing the work. It's interesting now that a lot of publishers, they're on board with, supporting artists about that. But I often wonder, the cynical side of me, what's coming down the road when, what happens when there's another recession and people can get really cheap art, maybe for their purposes. But who knows? That's in the future, and we'll see what happens. What happens with that? But yeah, it's certainly, I think, with every artist, it's certainly on our minds,
right,
at this point.
Sure. Oh, I wanted to get your take, so thank you for that. You mentioned your socials before. Is there a website where you recommend that people go to find out about your current and your future projects?
At the moment, the channels I use the most are my Instagram, which is nick.marinkovich, as well as my Facebook. I believe it's the same, Nick Marinkovich or Nick. But it'll be the same avatar for both. I do have a website in the works, which is nickmarinkovich.com. And that should be going live, I believe, 2 weeks from now, but it's currently not at present. But so definitely come find me on my Instagram and Facebook. I check those regularly, and I always reply to anyone who asks.
That's good.
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah. I like to keep in touch.
Yeah. Well, before I let you go, you mentioned before we started this that you're a big Star Trek fan, especially about the original series, like those old scientists. Wondering if you could name your favorite episode, and then maybe tell me what you think makes the original series so great.
Loaded question, man. Favorite episode? Jeez. You're putting me on the spot there.
I know it's tough.
I know.
It's tricky.
Plus when you rewatch it, then you're like, oh man, I remember this one. And in all honesty, I haven't watched it in a while now. I've been on a Next Generation binge.
Oh, okay.
Lately.
Okay.
Next Generation favorites? I mean, that's easy. What's the one? What's the one where Picard was, that probe, and he's living that other life?
Inner Light.
Inner Light, that's a great one. Always. Yeah. I mean, that's the classic great one.
Sure.
That's not a novel opinion. Everyone thinks that's the great one. Lower Decks, the classic Lower Decks.
Right.
I always really liked that one. You know what's another one? My guilty pleasure is, I believe it's called Parallels. Do you remember that one where Worf is jumping dimensions? He's coming back from a tournament. He's like in this temporal singularity of some sort. He's jumping from one to the other with these minute differences each time. I love that one. I don't know. Like, that's not the one that falls the most list, but for some reason I always come back to them. I found it really funny. For classic TOS, man, Guardian on the Edge of Forever.
Yeah.
Well, that's always a great one. I love
sure.
Like, that's the one. That's one of those remote droppers. Whenever it's on, I have to watch it.
Right. Absolutely. No, sorry for putting you on the spot, but I just thought since you're a big Star Trek fan, I wanted to get that out of you. That's for sure. Well, Nick, those really are all my questions. Is there something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview?
Just for people to keep on tap. Just some great projects that Fred and I are working on right now, and I don't know. I mean, aside from Dead Romans 2. Which news will be coming to that relatively quickly. Just another great one that we're working on. We just started working on right now, which will, be an eye opener for a lot of people. I can't say anything just yet, but I believe news should come around this fall for sure. And Fred and I will both be at New York for the convention this October. So come find us. Yeah, we won't be exhibiting. We'll just be making the rounds.
Thanks to Nick for the chat. You can discover more about Nick on Instagram at nick.marinkovich. That's Marinkovich. He's also got a website in the works. That's nickmarinkovich.com. Thanks for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts. And please check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel and hit the notification button. You can follow along at True North Country Comics on most social media sites. And you can always send your feedback to me, John Swinimer, at john@TrueNorthCountryComics.com. If you want to help the site and the podcast, please consider supporting the effort by chipping in at ko-fi.com/TrueNorthCountryComics. Your patronage is greatly appreciated. Thanks for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2023.